Today's episode is going to be a little bit different, let's say, than the usual. So, normally I've got investors, I've got founders that come on the show, hence the name Builders and Funders. Today we've got someone a little different. We've got a lawyer with us. Now, you might ask me, why a lawyer in a show that's about entrepreneurship? Well, I'll tell you why. A couple of reasons. One is you might have heard Trump just got elected, and he has decided to form a department called the Department of Government Efficiency, DOJ. It's been memed a lot. And Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, two business people that I greatly admire, are going to be at the head of it. What that means is they're going to review all the regulation that the government has been imposing on business people for the last several decades, and they're going to get to deregulate some of it, which means there are going to be lots of different opportunities to build interesting businesses. So if you're like me, you're an 18-year-old, you're 19, you're 20, 24, 25, even 30, 35 onwards, and you're thinking, how can I take advantage of this period, this next 4 years where all this regulation is going to go away? Paul is the perfect person for that, our guest today. He's been at the SEC, he's been at the DOJ. He knows the regulation better than most other people on the internet do. So he's got some fascinating ideas. We'll jam over that. Also, if you're a founder, there are so many ways for you to get scammed. One of the companies I used to build, we closed deals with foreign contractors, or we had foreign clients, and sometimes we wouldn't get paid or things would happen, and so I've had to learn the hard way. So Paul today is going to try and prevent that, tell you about how you could get scammed by employees, business partners, customers, investors, all that kind of stuff. He's got some interesting stories, all the way down to raiding boiler rooms with the Interpol and the Caribbean. Super interesting stuff. So without further ado, Paul, welcome to the Builders and Funders Show.
Thanks for having me, Bert. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I want to start with what I think will be the highest interest topic to most people and the most relevant topic to most people listening to this, which is, how do you take advantage of deregulation that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are going to bring on? So let's talk about that. First, maybe you can give a little bit of background about your background with the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice, and why you're the right person to speak on this.
Well, I appreciate the kind introduction. I think there's probably people who have deeper regulatory expertise than I do, but I'm certainly in the middle of a lot of regulatory stuff. I started out my legal career in the Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement. I spent 5 years there going after white-collar fraudsters of all kinds, a lot of cross-border stuff where people are doing what we call pump and dumps between the United States and Canada. So shut down a lot of those. And then after 5 years in enforcement, I moved to Washington, D.C. and joined the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance and worked on IPOs for just under 3 years. Then got a little bit tired of government because it was being reinvented. And so then I moved back to Seattle, went in-house at a very big company. It was Plum Creek Timber, which was a New York Stock Exchange listed company. But in 2000, the big .com thing was happening, and we'd already seen the run up by then. And I jumped over to a startup that was at first called NetStock Direct. It became ShareBuilder. I stayed there 12 years, highly regulated business. We sold it first to ING Direct in 2007 for $200 million. And then I stayed on until 2012, and we sold the whole thing, ING Direct and ShareBuilder, to Capital One for $9.5 billion. Since that time, I have been general counsel to about 35 startups and emerging growth companies. I'm currently general counsel to 8 companies. Actually, one I'm chief legal officer. And so I do a lot of business law all day long. I sign contracts all day long. I'm an adjunct law professor teaching counseling startups at Seattle U School of Law and at Gonzaga University. Got a book called Startup Law and Fundraising that is bought all over the world every day of the week. So yeah, I have a little bit of a regulatory background. Even before Trump won, there was something very important on the regulatory front that happened that really, really makes the work of the Department of Government Efficiency easier. And that's this doctrine called the Chevron Doctrine was overturned. This doctrine had been in place, I'm pretty sure, for decades. And it essentially was a statement by the U.S. Supreme Court that agencies receive deference in applying and interpreting the statutes authorizing their work. And so agencies have used the Chevron doctrine for decades to regulate in ways that many of us, many business lawyers, have considered to be beyond the scope of what was authorized. And so that doctrine was overturned just 4 months ago. And I think at least 10 regulatory schemes have fallen in that brief time. Most recently, I think it's Department of Labor. Their overtime rules were killed last week, a week before. And there's just been a slew of regulations that were already in front of various courts, federal courts around the country. And I don't think any of them have passed this new paradigm where people were challenging regulations for being overbroad, outside the scope of the agency's authority, and in some cases, most cases, also deemed to be or claimed to be arbitrary and capricious. So that alone was changing the regulatory landscape. And now you have Elon Musk, saying that, the DOJ is going to review every regulation for, whether or not it is consistent with the legislation enacting the scope of authority of the agency that adopted it. And so they're going to come up with a list, and I'm going to work on my own list to send to them. They're going to work on a list of regulations to put in front of Trump, and through executive authority, now we'll see how successful this is, to strike those regulations. But these are administrative rules and regulations, and that branch of government is under Trump. And so I'm pretty excited about it. And then what they said they're going to do next, which, would be too mean-spirited, but they are going to terminate an equal number of government employees relative to the scope of the regulations that are crossed out. Now, hopefully they're mapping over what regulations were crossed out and what employees are no longer needed. There's got to be some logic to it, but that seems to be where it's headed. And so I operate, in a variety of regulated, industries, and I'm pretty excited that some of my companies might be able to innovate more freely and to be less worried about regulatory overreach, which is a constant issue, for regulated businesses. So that's kind of where we're at. I need to come up with a list of things that should be struck. One, just personally, that it's not even really a business issue, but it's crazy annoying, is that Joe Biden made it legal for I think it's the Department of Treasury, to look at every person's bank account, or to have every transaction over $600 reported to the Treasury Department. I think it's Treasury or IRS. I can't remember. I don't think it's FinCEN. But that's a crazy overreach. That's just insane. And I am willing to bet a lot of money that one's not going to survive. And I think just all those things make doing business easier. But there's every area of regulation is now going to be under scrutiny. The other one that is very important, I think, is that the Securities and Exchange Commission has overregulated the crypto, sector brutally since 2016 or so. And I had a crypto company that I was really fond of. Initially, it was called Shop, and we lost that trademarks, and we pivoted to and it was going to be the crypto equivalent of Amazon. And the SEC really killed that indirectly, because they brought so many initial coin offering enforcement actions that were quite brutal. And they're still bringing actions from ICOs that happened in 2017. I think they're now going to stop, because it is extremely clear that Gensler is on the way out, Gary Gensler, the chairman of the SEC. And so I think that is going to usher in a new age for crypto in the United States. And obviously, I think Elon Musk likes crypto. And I think Trump likes crypto. So it's going to be a new age. We got some catching up to do, but I think we'll just be able to turn on a dime, that whole sector. And I might, enjoy getting back into it again. I was really sad to see every pressured out of business.
Yeah, well, yeah, we that was one of the reasons I had you mentioned Amazon of the blockchain. I was actually trying to build that with a friend of mine, not Amazon, but the Spotify of the blockchain, like a decentralized version. And sure enough, it wasn't regulation that got us. It was a scam that got us, which is one of the things we're going to get into. But I want to backtrack to something you mentioned, which is the Chevron doctrine. So
Yeah.
a lot of people that might be listening, they're like, "Dude, this isn't a law podcast. Why are you talking about laws now?" I think it's useful for every investor and founder to know about laws and know about the history of this kind of legislation and the precedents, et cetera. I think you're always going to be dealing with the government one way or another, no matter how small or how big you are. I've had companies doing very small amounts of money compared to a lot of bigger companies, and we've still had to sometimes know the FTC regulations and know
Yeah.
how to deal with them, or we get hit with fines no matter how small we are. So you always have to be aware of it. And for anyone listening, there are founders who sell digital products on Gumroad who've run into trouble with the FTC over numerous different things. So you never know, right? Even no matter how little revenue you're doing. So that's why this is useful. But I digress. Chevron doctrine, what was it, and how did that actually impact businesses?
Okay. And yeah, the FTC is going to be one of the agencies hit hardest, both by the overturning of the Chevron doctrine and by the Department of Governmental Efficiency, because the FTC's been on a bit of a tear. Again, the Chevron doctrine was a Supreme Court case, and I don't know if it's from the 50s or the 60s or the 40s, but it was a long-standing case. And our more conservative leaning Supreme Court overturned it. And essentially, the Chevron doctrine was that courts should give deference to agencies' interpretations of the legislation authorizing their scope of jurisdiction, what they can write rules and enforce rules around. And so it's that deference to the agency's interpretation of the statutes, they're enacting statutes that they operate under. There is no more deference to any agency of the United States about their
One second,
interpretation.
Paul. So let me get this straight for like in layman terms for founders who are like not very well educated around terms. That this means if you're Lena Khan and you're coming up with these cases for the FTC, basically the courts before the act was overturned would have to affirm your definition of what the law said. Like if you look at the law and say, look, this is what we think it means, the courts would have to affirm it, and then you could kind of overstep your
So
jurisdiction a little bit.
I'll give you an example. So in the crypto space, Gary Gensler has, in virtually all securities lawyers' view, misinterpreted what is a security. Now, it's a little bit different because we're talking about case law definition of a security, but the case law definition of a security is an investment in a common enterprise with an expectation of profits from the efforts of others. And so he has disregarded a couple of the legs of of that test. It didn't matter, and it doesn't matter if the token and the platform is already done. He's going to just say arbitrarily, oh, there's still efforts of others going on. And there isn't, right? There probably isn't. Just because maybe people are doing maintenance, or upgrades or debugging something or, whatever. He says that's efforts of others, even though everything's done. I took a different strategy with Every, and it was just that there cannot be any expectation of profits. And so all of our materials essentially said this token will trade at $1 and never more than $1. Don't, and we wrote everywhere, do not invest in, don't buy this token with an expectation of appreciation in price. And so Gensler, his enforcement actions were arbitrary and capricious in light of the case law. The Chevron doctrine is just a smidge different. Instead of that Howey four-part test being case law, say it was legislated, and then Gensler was bringing enforcement actions, essentially knowing that only prongs 1 and 2 maybe were met, an investment in a common enterprise, but not with an expectation of profits or not from the efforts of others. You kill any prong of that test and it's dead. And so what is happening now, again, agencies have regulated outside of their legislated authority by misinterpreting the legislation authorizing them to exist and to act too broadly. And so if they're exercising regulatory authority outside what the statute says, now any rules they adopt that exceed their statutory or legislated authority will be thrown out, just like the wage and hour increases. There was a minimum salary increase thing that the Department of Labor just had thrown out last week, and every week there's been a case or two where new rules are thrown out, and so new rules are being thrown out, and existing rules are being thrown out because they're being sued. There's one that one of my companies deals with, and that's LDTs, laboratory developed tests in the diagnostic space. There's a new rule a new rule adopted by the FDA, and it was sued immediately to regulate these lab developed tests because they wanted to, but it's not within their statutory authority. I am almost 100% sure those rules, which impede the ability of my company to innovate for life saving, life improving purposes, those rules, those LDT rules, will be thrown out. Someone else has already challenged them. I don't think they'll survive the challenge. And so for entrepreneurs, it just means that regulatory barriers and burdens are probably going to fall away left and right. So with the Chevron doctrine, people are litigating and turning those rules over, having them thrown out. And now you have the DOJ, and they're going to just come up with their own list of rules for Trump to strike out at an executive level. You don't have to go to court. They're just going to line them out, and he's going to issue an executive order saying these 2,000 rules or these 1,500 rules are off the books. They know they can no longer be enforced. And so I think it'll be very interesting, and they are going to move quickly because they have pledged to sunset the DOJ July 4, 2025. They've given themselves, a year and a half to get this, half a year to get this done, which is crazy. That would be the most extreme deregulation, if it happens, in the history of any country. Oh, well, no, wait. What's the guy? Who's the nut in Argentina?
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yes, he got there first.
I don't know exactly what he's done, but he campaigned with a chainsaw, and it was a very similar promise.
He had the video of how he had this whiteboard with all the different government departments, and he just ripped them off one by one. Department of Education gone, this department gone, and he just axed all of them. And sure enough, Argentina's economy's last time the headlines, it seems to be doing great. So
they are having a little bit of trouble, but any kind of extreme, and they were in bad shape, really, really bad shape before. So they were not doing this from a position of strength, but rather weakness. The other thing I think that will be very good is kind of a little more nuanced, but our IPO market has been clogged up, and and that means that raising money for startups has been clogged up because IPOs and acquisitions pull money through the system. They give earlier investors, who invested in something 8 years ago, a big return on their investment, and then that money goes back to the beginning of the funnel and goes into startups, and the whole system is blocked up. And even the FTC has made acquisitions a problem because they've been bringing, I think they're essentially Hart-Scott-Rodino sort of actions, claiming that this acquisition and that acquisition violates antitrust. They're doing things like trying to make Google get rid of Chrome. That kind of stuff is not going to fly after, January 15? The FTC is not going to be able to tell Google to get rid of Chrome for Pete's sake. I mean, what a ridiculous, it's just one ridiculous thing after another. Uh, that's like telling Bergman luggage, you can't do luggage anymore. You just did too great with luggage, right? Like what? So Google made Chrome and it's too ubiquitous. It's too good. Someone else has to have that. That sounds like, something from Cuba. So all that stuff is going to go away. But my other point is that by getting rid of all these burdensome regulations and by skinnying down government, we're going to slow our spending down, and that I think is going to reduce tax burdens, and that helps everybody. There's no such thing as no taxes, but when high income earners are paying 47% or whatever it is, and corporations have pretty high corporate tax, that just limits investment. And anything that limits investment limits business growth. Another thing that's been going on that will hopefully stop is if you've ever seen a chart of the M1 money supply for the last, 6 years, and you can look at it from the beginning of time. If you look at it from the beginning of time, the M1 money supply is the amount of money in circulation. And then when you get to 2021, it goes like this. And so all you got to do is Google that M1 money supply, and you'll see that we've been printing money, and printing money causes inflation. People are like, oh, well, where did inflation come from? Yeah, I think it's from the 10,000% increase in the M1 supply. You might want to look there. Printing money might be the culprit, and then just giving it away. And so if we can get inflation under control, what else happens? Then interest rates come down, and companies and individuals have more freedom to borrow. They're less financially pressured. That helps investment and growth of business. So there's a lot of things that could be very positive for entrepreneurs and innovation in the coming years. So I think those are the biggies right there.
One of the things you mentioned is I think for the last few years, like you said, it's been the IPO market's been basically dead, and acquisitions have dried up, and the FTC's come after any company that's trying to go into M&A, and so and that affects people, entrepreneurs going from 0 to 1 as well, because then their VCs don't have any liquidity and they don't have anything to reinvest, and they're also scared because now they know the more portfolio companies they take on, the less likely a lot of those portfolio companies are to reach some kind of liquidity event. So you mentioned with the new administration and with DOJ, especially with everything that's going to happen, the IPO market's going to ease. Does that, for those listening, just for them to understand as well, does that mean someone like me or someone maybe a little older than me who's trying to build a venture-backed startup, it's going to become easier for them to raise, say, their pre-seed round or seed round or Series A round? Does that mean at the very bottom of the funnel, it also gets a lot easier for an entrepreneur to essentially get those first checks?
Yeah, and I don't know what the lag is going to be, if any. Uh, I don't know to what extent, and it's probably something we could figure out just by looking for a report from PitchBook, how much seed and pre-seed money is just sitting on the sidelines because of anxiety about the IPO market versus are all the funds dried up and they can't write checks because they don't have money. I think it's kind of a mix. I think that anxiety and uncertainty causes capital to freeze up, and then actual IPO illiquidity, situation also, and the M&A, market being seized up by, I think, regulatory threat. It's a combination of those things. It's actual money, being frozen in place, and then the fear of, like, if I deploy capital, like, what's going to happen if you invest in a startup in a time when there's not a lot of available capital? Then when the startup runs out of money, they might not be able to get more money unless you put it in. But you're a seed investor, and they need Series A investment in a year and a half or two. And is that Series A investment going to be there? So that might be a chilling effect that, Chevron, DOJ, FTC being, reined in, SEC being reined in a bit, FDA being reined in a bit, that, could just create just sort of a general excitement, as well as actually freeing up resources, because people do and businesses do anticipate and try to see the future and act on it, because if you wait too long, then you miss the opportunity. And so I think there's going to be some excitement, hopefully, in the markets. And I've already seen a little bit of it, I think. I mean, I just had a limit order on stock. I didn't think I was going to be able to sell it, and it spiked up 50%, 48% yesterday, and hit a limit order. And I felt kind of dumb because it blew right past my price. Like, so there might already be some excitement in the market. Meta hit an all time high yesterday. I still have my IPO shares; they're up 1,300 something percent.
That's one hell of an investment. So we said okay, so for a founder like myself who's like just building stuff in the trenches, one of the ways it's going to affect us is it's going to become easier to raise money. The conversation with the VCs is going to be a little easier, and they're going to have a little bit less anxiety. Hopefully, as you mentioned, no one knows when no one knows when that effect will actually hit, but it seems that side seems to be optimistic. And then we talked about how it's an excellent time to look into crypto, how ICO investigations are going to die down, and it's going to be a lot easier to build any kind of decentralized company, decentralized app, decentralized, or even just crypto tokens. And that's going to become easier. What are some other, you mentioned, any company that deals with the FDA, they're going to have a bit of an easier time now with regulation being killed. What are
We
some other
hope.
industries?
We hope.
We hope, right?
It looks
But
like it based on who's been selected.
Of course. So, like, for someone like me who's looking at other industries where, that deregulation is going to hit and there's going to be new ideas that open up. Like Y Combinator says, there are a few occasions where great ideas emerge, and one of them is deregulation, when just rules disappear and there's all this new uncharted territory. So, crypto, hopefully, anything that deals with the FDA. What are some other frontiers do you think that a builder could pay attention and be like, you know what? If the opportunity presents itself, or it seems like there's going to be an opportunity here, I should pay attention. Or maybe you're an investor. Like, where should you be? Where else should you be looking at that those might affect?
Well, you know, given the chaos in the world, and maybe this will start to die down, uh, you know, there's a lot of startups. And in fact, I spent some time with one just the other day that are doing defense related stuff, and related to drones and things, and high technology related, that has multiple applications. But Trump being someone who favors a strong military, and his team is going to be very insightful about the importance of technology to close other gaps, and to technology is America's strength, right? Nobody can keep up with us when we're not restrained, unless they steal our ideas. And I think, one, we're getting better at stopping foreign governments from stealing our ideas. We're not perfect, but so I think defense is one. Another one that's interesting, and maybe not be that much interest to your audience, is there's going to be opportunities in energy. The current administration has been very down on energy because they would prefer that people walked everywhere, right? And that they lived in cold houses. And so if you now embrace the very real fact that advanced societies are run on energy, right? And every society, back to the beginning, the ability to make and sustain fire was energy. And you couldn't have a civilization without it, generally speaking. And so now complex modern societies require all this energy. And then there's been this unfortunate denial of that fact. And I'm not, trying to say that I don't like, efficiency and, clean energy and everything. But when you have statutes that are now probably not going to be able to be passed, saying you can't buy a new gas furnace. You got to use an electric furnace, which is less efficient because we say so. You can't buy a very efficient gas or hybrid car because we want you to plug it in, because we might want to unplug it. So there's a lot of things in energy that could be interesting. I don't know. One thing that might cut against technology there is that older school energy supplies might become so cheap that it's hard to harder to make advancements in alternative energy and products. I don't know yet. I'm not an energy expert. I think one thing that is good to know or helpful to know is the FTC has, maybe the broadest regulatory authority over business of any agency other than the SEC. And to a certain extent, the FDA is very, very broad in their regulatory scope. It's food, it's drugs, it's medical devices, medical software. They try and encroach into things that are just sort of health, and they're not really, or wellness. And so there's a lot that the FDA might be restrained in regulating, way more than meets the eye. And the FTC, their scope of regulation is kind of multifaceted. If you're too good at what you do and you dominate your field, they're going to want to throttle you the way they're doing with Chrome, right? And to me, that's just ridiculous. That is not American at all. We like to think about this, like Levi Strauss, so good at making jeans. You got to sell your jeans line. You can stick with tank tops and hats, but those damn jeans are too good, right? That's just insane. And now that's where we are. Levi Strauss is, I shouldn't say it out loud because the FTC, you know what? Those Levi's are just too popular, right? This is a ridiculous monopoly you have on cool jeans or, sturdy jeans. And so the FTC regulates monopolistic practices or anything anti-competitive. And so Chrome is apparently anti-competitive, probably because it's too good or something. I don't know what their thinking is. I haven't read it. I hear it and I just go, I don't even want to know what these people are thinking because it's obviously dumb. And all their kind of continued regulation, around things like, privacy and stuff. I'm fine with privacy, but I would never want to go as far as California, probably, and certainly not the general data privacy regulation of Europe, where you make one mistake, you owe $20 million. Like, you're just trying to kill businesses. And then other things, so the FTC regulates all kinds of advertising, and I don't mind that so much, but they can be a little bit heavy-handed in that area. So it's hard to say what you can say about your product and not get into trouble. Another huge area for all businesses in the country, again, is the Department of Labor, and also the Labor Board. And so the Department of Labor sets and keeps creating new rules, making it impossible to do business, very difficult to do business, to have employees. And so that is probably going to be dialed back for the benefit of all businesses. And then the National Labor Relations Board, he's going to change that out. And what's been going on there is, to me, overreach. If Starbucks wants to close a store, they say it's retaliation. Like, I think Starbucks has a right to close a store. And I think you don't have the right, NLRB, to say Starbucks has to keep a store open. But that is what they are saying, right? And so a lot of this NLRB stuff is kind of overreaching. And they brought a lot of cases around what's called protected concerted activity or concerted protected activity. And so it's now, it's now punishable if you, if an employee goes online and bashes management and calls them racist pigs, and we need a union because they're racist pigs, that is protected by the NLRB, even though it's probably false and probably very clearly defamatory, right? So, and I'm not an expert on like the latest cases they've brought, but they have made it darn clear that you can really unload and say kind of whatever you want against management. and that harms business. And one way that harms business is you have to spend a lot of money dealing with it. You get the NLRB or someone coming after you, just plan on writing a check for $500,000, and it's unfair. And so, a lot of this is death by a thousand cuts across the entire economy. So, it's really hard to say how broad this is going to be because we don't, what is the department, the Farm Bureau doing that we don't know about? What's the Department of Agriculture doing in innovation? We don't know what's going on. What's the Department of Education doing to stifle innovative education, technologies? It just seems like when you have bloated bureaucracies, you have a lot of people just sitting around figuring out what to do. And it usually involves, it seems to me, attacking business. And a lot of it doesn't seem to have an ROI for the American public. Now, I'm not an expert in everything they're all doing, but I think some experts are going to be looking at what they're doing. And I'm kind of happy about that.
I want to go back to a couple of things you said. So the first thing you mentioned was defense is going to be really interesting, and obviously both Palmer Luckey and Peter Thiel were big backers of the Trump administration, and I think Palmer Luckey even got fired from Facebook after his company Oculus was acquired by Facebook, and he was fired for a donation he had made to the Trump campaign, I think. But so like defense is interesting because I just saw the news of three college physics students who got into Y Combinator with a combat drone idea. They were 3D printing combat drones. And that was really exciting to me because I've talked to Israeli friends of mine and they're starting to go work at defense companies, try and collect as much experience as they can because they're really optimistic about where that's headed to. And they think it's going to be one of the big industries. So I don't have a story there. I just wanted to emphasize that. I
Yeah.
thought that's an excellent point you made there because it is going to be the next big thing with where the world is headed. And if you're a young person, I certainly am really interested in that. And I've been learning, brushing up on my physics and all sorts of knowledge that relate to those. And you also mentioned marketing. So the FTC has done a lot of regulate a lot of the marketing initiatives that companies have launched. In fact, I want to see if we can tell a story about one of your clients. That was a brokerage company that was basically got put a gag order on them because of something they said in the marketing campaign. Could you tell that story to the audience and maybe also like why they should be wary of the things they put in their marketing and how that might come back to them to the
Yeah.
extent you can reveal?
Well, there's, without sort of disclosing who the client is, the regulator was a financial regulator, but you have very similar concerns with the FTC when you do what is called comparative marketing. And comparative marketing is a lot like what it sounds like. You see all the time in pitches, for example, that someone will say, our product has all these features. They'll do a grid, like, maybe features horizontally, and then, our product here, and maybe other products. And it's like the company that's pitching has all the green check marks, and some have green and X marks, you know, and if you use that in advertising, it has to be factual you can't lie because the federal trademark statute is called the Lanham Act, and it forbids false comparison. And in the case that you mentioned, our comparison was accurate, and I was general counsel, and I got along very well with my marketing and product teams. And at first, the regulator said, you can do this. It's fine. They signed off on the actual advertising. And then they changed their mind. And they likely changed their mind because a competitor had seen it or something. And we pulled it down and we reworked it. And it was ironclad, safe, correct. We could document every comparison. And we went to the regulator and said, hey, we're going to come back with this. I hope you find this acceptable. And they said, no, it's not acceptable. And so as a lawyer, I tend to be pretty risk tolerant, but a lot of times because I thought we had the law on our side. And so I told, my head of product, who's still someone I like quite a bit, even though this is quite a few years ago, uh, hey, if you do this, I said, you're not going to like it. And that movie Backdraft probably wasn't out for too long at that time. I don't know, 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, I don't know. But Backdraft, the ad was just like someone opens a door and it's just fire. It's just fire. And it was pretty catchy advertising. You could probably still find it very easily. Backdraft trailer, check it out. And so he knew the reference. I said, man, if you launch that thing so quickly, it's going to feel like, you know, this Backdraft trailer. And he did it. And I don't know, the next day we got we got a letter saying we are bringing enforcement action. And they initially said it was, 1.4 million dollars. And I essentially had to fly to Washington D.C. and sit down with some folks, and I think I got it down to 420,000 or 240,000 maybe. But it was very distracting. And then the thing that was interesting was that, I had predicted that this would be very bad for him and his team. And the penalty I could not negotiate away was that this financial regulator had to review every piece of advertising, every promotional email, every landing page, every change to the website that millions of people went to a day, seemingly, um, and very active, high profile website, akin to like something like Expedia. Just as many people were going to our thing, I think, as go to Expedia. And so you can imagine every change has to be approved by these regulators who are not on, not moving at the speed of business. So, I don't want to laugh too much about it, but that happened.
That's fascinating. I want to. So, like you mentioned that you had warned them before. I want to take this moment. You launched this startup of your own to make sure things are compliant and for investors and entrepreneurs. Even though it's not about like broad complying with every regulation, I think it's for a specific use case. I want to take a moment to talk about that. Before we move on.
Sure.
Then I also want to talk about or ask you about like you've been doing this for decades now. Choosing the right lawyer is often incredibly important. How do you pick the right lawyer who's not gonna either get you in trouble and not warn you in advance, or how do you know who to trust and who to not trust? What are some red flags a founder should look for?
Well, I guess one thing I'll point out, Burke, is that so I have a website, a blog called it's Startup GC, which is General Counsel, startupgc.us. And at startupgc.us, I have a global startup registry, global startup council registry. And the reason I formed that is because of the book that I showed you, Startup Law and Fundraising, which gets purchased all over the world 24/7. Uh, I get a lot of calls from people saying, "Hey, would you work for us?" Or who do you recommend in Palestine? Who do you recommend, in Paris, or Chicago, or Chattanooga? And I'm like, man, I'm just gonna research this for a few months, couple months, and put together this startup, council registry. And so there I have, I don't know if I have 50 cities covered with folks that I've, corresponded with. I've got them to confirm. They'll give a free consultation. They'll give fair rates to startups. They'll give a little break to startups. And they have the expertise to do essentially what I do, which, I've been doing, I've been general counsel of 35 startups starting in 2000. I kind of know startup law and fundraising. That's why I named my book that. And so these folks are also, I think they're pretty good. I can't, vouch 100% or warrant guarantee their work, but it's where I send people, and I've never had a complaint. And that registry has been posted for a couple of years now, or something like that, and I think it gets a lot of hits. So I think um, if you're going to work with an attorney that's not on that list, I think it's always good to ask, how many startups have you formed? What's your intellectual property strategy? How do you set up what's your go-to capitalization table? How many shares do you authorize? How many do you reserve into an option pool? How many do you grant to founders? Do you have um, templates for everything under the sun to form and govern companies and protect intellectual property? How many patent applications have you supported? Uh, what's your approach to trademark registration? Do you do it or do you have someone else do it? How much does it cost? How many have you filed? Uh, you know, are you able to help with contracts? What's your experience with contracts? This book also, Contract Drafting and Negotiation, is sold all over the world too, and not every lawyer is good at contracts, and that's the lifeblood of companies. And so, if you're going to work with someone, they've got to be able to help you with some contracts. They got to help you protect your intellectual property. And then the other thing is, how much money have you raised, and what kind of, what's your strategy for a pre-seed round and a seed round, and are you able to help companies find investors? And what is your strategy? My strategy, I could tell you in 2 seconds. We spend a couple hours on Crunchbase. We might have to knock back a beer or something because it's drudgery. We're going to find comparable companies. We're going to find out who invested in them. We're going to come up with a list of names. Then we're going to try and figure out how we can get a warm introduction to the ones that we think are most likely to write checks at the phase this company's at. And we put a few hours into that. So what is a lawyer's strategy for helping to raise funds? Raising funds is one of the hardest things for a founder, and to have an attorney in your corner who's willing to help out and able to help out and get that money in the door is somewhat priceless. It's kind of a lonely business and a hard thing for someone who's never done it before, and most people fail. Really, I mean, the number one reason startups fail is lack of product market fit. Number two is they run out of money. And they run out of money in part because of lack of product market fit, but they run out of money also because they don't know how to raise money. And so those are the types of things that a founder should ask an attorney about. And I think folks might like me are a little bit rare, but they're not unheard of. And a lot of folks now are doing what I do, which I don't call it fractional GC, but obviously I have 8 companies, so it's not full-time GC. No one has a claim on all my time, but I think of it as part-time, but I calibrate what they pay to how many hours I think they need, and it tends to work out pretty well. Um, and I think there's others who they call themselves fractional general counsel. I might start with them, especially if they say they focus on startups, because when you have a fractional general counsel, you have someone on your team that is able to do all the things that we just talked about, and maybe they'll do it in part for equity and in part for a very small salary. And so that when someone's hourly, you might not call them for stuff because you're afraid to rack them a tab. But if you've agreed to pay them some small annual salary for a couple hours a week, like for a few hours a week, couple hours a week, I'll charge 50 grand a year and I get my equity slug too, right? So that's like nothing. A lot of startups, if I can help them raise some money, they can cover that. And sometimes I take it as low as 35,000 if I think they're just going to pester me for an hour a week. And I'll take 35 grand to help someone with their company and be involved in a cool product. And if we raise more money and they need more time, then we just renegotiate that. But finding someone who will do kind of what I do, uh, if you need a lot of what we just talked about, protect trademarks, protect patents, negotiate contracts, raise money, handle HR, a little bit of helping guide HR. I don't handle it, but I make sure that we sign the right documents with employees. That's the type of lawyer that I would recommend founders look for. Someone who's on the team. I'm on the team of all 8 of my companies. They can call me 24/7, and that's the kind of people that I would like to work with if I were a founder. Someone who's just got really good availability, very responsive. It might take a day to turn a contract around with 8 companies, but some lawyers will sit on a contract for 2 weeks. But, does that answer that question for you, Burke?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go back to the previous story you mentioned where you're talking about how you have to make sure that you're accurate and you're not lying. You had this other story about an EV startup you were involved in and how so a
Yeah.
lot of founders, just virtue of the job, they tend to be salesmen. And a
Mm-hmm.
part of sales is unfortunately hyperbole. You have to be
Puffery.
a little
Call it
hyperbolic.
puffery. Puffery is fine.
There you go, exactly. And so I want to, to the extent you can reveal, get you to talk about that EV startup and what happened, because the founder, I think, was a little hyperbolic, or a little might be an understatement, but that ended up in an absolute sham. So I want to tell that story as a bit of a cautionary tale to any founder who might find himself in a situation similar. So I'd love to talk about that story as well a little bit.
Yeah, and yeah, I won't mention any names, but it was in the EV space. This founder was somewhat, he was incompetent in a lot of ways, and he was unethical in many other ways. And he just used to hang out at a place it's in my neighborhood, and I go up there and watch football games or whatever. And for 2 years, he begged me to be the CEO of his company, and I would literally tell him, like, I wouldn't work with you. You're not a bad guy to have a beer and watch a football game with, but I wouldn't work with you, And I probably told him, one, you're a bit of a nut. Two, I kind of am concerned about you, and some of the stuff you've told me essentially leads me to believe that you've been out there raising money by lying. And so he said, you can be CEO, you can be chairman of the board. I will step back, but I'm at an impasse and I need help. And I'm just, as you've put it, Paul, I just can't do this. I can't get it done. And I'll just work on the cars, and I'll be kind of maybe just president of the product line. And I resisted and resisted. And then I signed this agreement with him, and I told him I've got to bring in a CFO because your financials are in a shambles, and you have no business plan. You have no financial forecasts. You've got nothing, just a bunch of nonsense. So I agreed to do it. And we really got this thing far along. And I spent a whole week in China, and it was pretty awesome. Strange, because I was constantly followed by the Chinese Communist Party, but they were so sick of this nut that they were thrilled that Mr. Paul had arrived. That's what they called me, Mr. Paul. They tried to drink me under the table, and I'm like, yeah, I don't think you can do that. I'm from a town called Seattle. You don't know what you're up against here, and so I went to China and worked on these cars, and wrote probably an 8-page report on all the fixes that needed to be done to like 4 car models. And the cars were cool. I mean, there's videos of me just tearing it up in these cars, screeching and burning rubber and having a great time in China. And, all the CCP people are, like all anxious and like, this is out of control. But they liked seeing their cars tear it up. Like no one had done that. Just some American nut from Seattle, doing donuts in their parking lot of the factory, which part of the factory had like World War II kind of, carts and stuff in it. It was pretty awesome from a cultural perspective. I got back a lot of our patent rights. I renegotiated the contract, and they were more than happy because they were so concerned about this nut job. And I had an agreement with that guy that he would not talk to the press anymore. And on the way back from the China trip, I somehow figured out that he had talked to like GeekWire or something, like some business journal, and made another sort of set of false statements to raise money. And we were not going to raise money until I had fixed everything, and the CFO, who's still a good friend, had fixed everything. And we got back to Seattle. We had everything really going forward. There were still some duties, customs stuff that we had to figure out about how to get the cars over, because that guy had made mistakes about what was required for all the VINs to be allowed in. And so we're like, hey, no big deal. We're just learning as we go. But then all of a sudden, one day, he never liked meeting. And so he had a window to meet between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m. He couldn't meet in the morning, and he couldn't meet past. And it was largely, I think, because he was like 70. I think he was drinking every day. And I found out later, getting pretty high every day. And so he had a 2-hour window, and I was telling him, we got to work harder. You're head of product. You're president of product. You've got to be available. And he one day then just said, "You're fired." And he couldn't fire me because I was chairman of the board. Like, you're fired, and the CFO is fired. I'm like, I wouldn't do that. Do you know that I sue people for fun? I have put people behind bars, and I have sued. By then I'd probably filed at least 500 lawsuits. I currently have 20 outbound lawsuits right now, just all over the country for a bunch of different countries, mostly collecting debts that people owe, but also protecting intellectual property and so forth. Like, you are gonna let me sue you? Like, you have like 24 hours to rethink this nonsense, and you should talk to a lawyer. And he didn't rethink it, so I sued him. Essentially, I got every penny. But what I did was I deposed the whole team for 5 days, and everyone on the team essentially said, reluctantly, that yes, everything I'm saying is true, and everything he's saying is false, and that he's doing this to just take the company back now that you've fixed it and made it viable. And so I took every penny out of the bank account in a settlement. I still have some stock. There's still a website, but I don't know what is going on. But he had done so. One thing he had done is committed a lot of securities fraud. So I sent a referral, since I'm good at that kind of thing, to a state regulator, and they hit him pretty hard with everything I wrote, and they came up with more fraud. And so there's a 9-page order out there about this guy that caused him to move from one state to another because he felt like he couldn't do anything in that state based on that order, saying he really couldn't be in business anymore. So that's kind of a colorful story, I guess.
Huh. That's I want to talk about a lesson I picked up, and you can kind of add on top of it. But you mentioned in the very beginning, like you'd go to this bar
That's
and
the
you'd
lesson.
talk to
That's
him.
the lesson, the very beginning. No, I shouldn't have done anything with them.
Yep. And so, a lot of people, no matter how young or old, they usually have an intuition about the people they meet. You usually get a sense of like, well, this guy doesn't really seem like a good fit. I don't think this would work out. And so, usually people just get that feeling. And so, I guess the big lesson that I'm picking up here is just trust your gut, just trust your intuition, and never doubt yourself when you're not a hell yeah, and when you don't really feel like this is the right person to do it. I think it's
That's
safe to say
That
that's the
is
big
the
lesson there.
message. And there's a thing that I always tell my law students, and that is that everything that can happen does happen. And I don't really mean that everything goes south, but it's like the craziest stuff that you could possibly imagine. Oh, it could happen. It's not in your imagination. This guy signed away all control essentially over the company, except that he still had the ownership, but my contract was not cancelable in the way that he canceled it. So he still had the majority ownership of the company and the voting control, but my contract was not cancelable in this manner. And the craziest thing was that he was willing to litigate with someone who's a former federal prosecutor, former SEC litigator. I'm going to litigate at the SEC for 5 years, Justice Department a couple of years. I file lawsuits. I could sit in front of a football game and complete a lawsuit ready to file the next Monday, without breaking a sweat, and he's going to sue me. So my lawsuit against him was just withering. And I sent it across to him like, you got 24 hours where this is getting filed. And he let it get filed. And it's just anything that can happen does happen. And so you're right. The lesson there is you got to trust your judgment. I don't feel like that was the worst experience. I mean, I got to go to China. I had fun with this CFO, who's still a good friend, and we
You
worked
got to
really
hang out with the
hard.
CCP,
I
the
got to hang
CCP
out with,
officers.
my communist buddies. There's a great picture of me drinking them under the table a little bit, that I'll cherish forever. They're all sitting around. They got this white wine, and it's crazy, stuff. And they want to just do cheers around the table, and I'm like, bring it, you know. And they were pretty impressed, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So just trust your gut about people, and if it seems like they've got some red flags, they've lied before, they've admitted to lying, they've admitted to deception, just stay away. I mean, like you said, things that do tend to,
And
if it can go
especially,
wrong,
yeah, especially if
yeah.
you're just a founder and you're not a hardcore lawyer, litigator, right? You're really at a disadvantage relative to where I was because I just deposed these people for 4 days and they yelled uncle, and I took every penny out of the bank account. So that again too wasn't too bad. So yeah, founders really, one of the things that I focus on with founders is making sure that they're compatible and that they're aligned and that they see things the same way, they're pursuing the same mission, they see the same fundraising path, the same exit path, same company culture. They understand the equity split that makes sense between them, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, first ever episode I had on for this show was with a gentleman called Tony Campbell, and he was ex Bessemer venture capitalist, and he said the biggest reason why companies between seed and Series A die is co-founders agreements. They're just misaligned, and it kills the company, and so that makes a lot of sense. Now we talked about partners, we talked about stuff to watch out for, just like things to avoid. I want to talk about employees now because no matter what stage, usually as you grow the company, you start hiring people, and as you get bigger, you hire more. And so the story of, I believe the name is Augustine Olobia, is an interesting one. An employee who stole over $1.5 million, I think, from her employer, creating a fictitious vendor. Love to hear about that story and how a founder could like try and avoid something like that happening to them.
Yeah, so the whole fictitious vendor scam hits a lot of companies. I see those stories every week hitting all kinds of businesses and philanthropies and churches and just any business anywhere where there's money, and it could be people in the finance or accounting department. It can be folks in the marketing department or the business development department. And I don't want to cast aspersions on folks in those departments, but they have the ability to create a vendor and then start paying invoices. And lo and behold, they're the vendor and they're not providing services. And in a in a small company with limited resources, it can be tricky to spot that. And the company where this happened had pretty strong controls. There was one individual who's a good friend of mine. He feels the most guilty about it because it was his direct report. But I don't think of that guy as a slacker by any means. And when you have audits, accounting, financial audits, gap audits, they ping vendors and they're good at digging in at vendors. And it sort of reveals a potential business opportunity for someone out there watching this. Financial audits are crazy expensive. And even if your company is super basic, you're going to pay 50 grand these days. And in part because of regulations that should be rolled back. So that's another one I need to add to my list. Can't remember if it's Graham Leach Bliley or it's right back here. What is this? Um, it's one of these books. I can't see it. I must have gotten rid of it. But it's the requirements, the gap requirements and the SEC requirements, um, for audits and for auditors, and it makes it so expensive that companies really can't afford to do audits. They're crushingly expensive. Um, an audit to go public might be $1 million these days. That's a lot of money for one part of the program. And in part, I'll bet, I'll bet the auditors themselves could tell you how to take $500,000 out of that. And so, um, if someone could develop a way to ping vendors, test vendors, prove vendors, and just to help someone with a business model, um, you have to connect with the vendor and you have to force the vendor within 24 hours to demonstrate what their service is. And there's probably other things you can do. Whatever the big six or whatever they are now, big four accounting firms are, whatever they're doing to ping vendors, I think they just send some paper and tell us what you do, blah, blah, blah. But an ironclad, really robust, technologically savvy way to validate vendors, that's a business model. Maybe the most valuable thing we came up with today.
Huh, that's no, I had come up with another business idea I wrote down earlier when you were talking about your approach to as soon as you start working with a company. This might be the second best business idea I've got. I actually might start building stuff from this interview. This is
I'll work with
insanely
you
good.
on it if you want.
You know what? I'm tempted. I'm really tempted. I want to talk about something
Vendo.
else.
Vendo would be a good name. It's like a play on Venmo, but it's Vendo.
There you go. You know what, let me think on this. Let me think. But another thing I want to talk about. So we talked about partners, employees, and there are international organized crime groups that prey on businesses, American businesses. They steal their IP. They make sure they do everything to scam them. While you were, I believe, at one of the enforcement agencies, you were raiding a lot of different, boiler rooms in the
Yep.
Caribbean, different places. You were attacking a lot of the, dealing with a lot of the mafia there. Love to talk about those stories as well and how those groups particularly prey on American businesses and how you were kind of stopping them, what American business can watch out for and how they can. One of the things you taught me, or one of the things that we talked about in our prep call, was being careful when you do business with a lot of foreign entities, especially if they're in certain countries like
Yeah.
China or Pakistan, etc. You may not either receive your money or you may not, or they may not. Yeah, there are always going to be different issues you run into with your accounts receivable or payable, and so you have to be wary with that. But I'd love to hear about that story.
Yeah, sure. And just, for the benefit of the audience, one of the biggest scams that is perpetrated internationally, and there's quite a few, but again, it's kind of a fake invoice scam. When you file a trademark, it's public record. Once it becomes public record, I think fairly quickly, and so foreign scammers understand a little bit about U.S. trademark law, and they'll start sending invoices for maintenance fees. Oh, send us this $167 for your trademark maintenance fee for X mark, and they know the mark. They tell you the mark. It looks official. They kind of play on the name USPTO, which is our U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Um, and so that's a really common scam. And every time I come to a new company, it's one of the things that I tell the folks in the accounting, accounts payable department. It's like, don't ever pay anything about a trademark or other intellectual property without talking to me first. And now, if there's someone that's in charge of all the domain registrations, like good. If we have someone who manages the domain portfolio, great. But this trademark stuff, you will definitely get invoices. They're not huge, but no one likes to be scammed. And once you get scammed, you oftentimes get yourself on a sucker list. And the sucker list has value. So scammers sell their sucker lists. And so getting scammed begets getting scammed more. But the story you're talking about, was kind of interesting. I was in enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And one of the things that we noticed during my time there was that lots of Americans were getting scammed out of Costa Rica and Panama. And they were getting these glossy solicitations to invest mostly in mining type activities. And these were international mafias of a sort based out of Vancouver, Canada, Gibraltar, and the UK. And there were a group of loosely affiliated scammers, and they would go around and set up boiler rooms. And a boiler room, there's a show called Boiler Room now. So like I was doing it before anyone knew what a boiler room was. I was shutting them down. Is an organization that purports to be selling legitimate securities investments. And so each of these boiler rooms was funded to the tune of about $200,000. And they would get an office either mostly in Costa Rica. There were like 8 or 9 in Costa Rica, and there were 1 or 2 in Panama. And they would prepare a pitch, and they were very creative. They were good at this. They were good at glossy brochures, before AI could just help you do everything. And so they would put a lot of money. They would have an office, they would have a phone, they would have a receptionist who showed up every day of the week, and they would have salespeople, closers, and others. And these people, they didn't do any calls. They wouldn't call anyone for almost a year. They would send really cool brochures about these opportunities to invest. And they all had different names: Growth Capital Securities, Panama Investment Corporation, Swiss, something Swiss investments. There was like 11 of them. And so eventually, and they were taking, I think, about, which at this time was a lot of money, and they were taking it from the really poor people. They were taking about 20 to 50 million dollars, or $20 million a day maybe, or something, across all these companies. International Swiss Investments was one. And so a gentleman that I worked with at the time, named Larry Kaiser, he and I just, we filed all these lawsuits, and then we went to Costa Rica, and we spent 2 trips there. I spent 2 trips, he spent one, and there were week-long trips. And we essentially went around. I went around, mostly it was just me. I don't know why he didn't go on some of this stuff. I don't know what he was doing, staying at the American Embassy, where I had to go every night and fax things. But we would go around and depose and interview people who were involved in the organizations. As soon as we landed, Interpol kicked in the doors of every one of these things in Costa Rica, for sure, and got all of their records. And, the United States, that couldn't quite happen that way. But in Costa Rica, and I'm sure this is still the case, the court system is totally integrated. The judge is the investigator, the judge, and the jury. And they don't have the same types of rules that we have. And we didn't even know that. We didn't know, for example, they were going to go to a lawyer's office and take everything related to these companies. And we would not do that in the United States. I didn't authorize or to request it. When we analyzed the issue under, U.S. and foreign law, international law, we're like, okay, well, we've got it now. We can use it. And so all these doors were kind of kicked in, and somehow, as soon as one of them happened, they all fled. And on one of the trips, I had put out a border alert, and a gentleman named Stanley Langsman, and you can just Google this, Stanley Langsman, Securities and Exchange Commission. I deposed that guy in a prison twice. And actually, Interpol called me at like 3 a.m. We've got Stanley Langsman. He was trying to enter the country, I think, to see his girlfriend or something. And they're like, do you want us to drive by and see you and pick him? You can ride to prison, to jail with him. I'm like, sure, this is interesting. And so they came with their Interpol Jeep, and they're 2 armed Interpol people, and then this prisoner. And he looked at me, and I had a suit and tie on, as you might well imagine, 3 or 4 in the morning in San Jose, Costa Rica. And they picked me up at my hotel, and this guy looks at me, he's like, he's English. He's like, "You're from the SEC, aren't you?" And I flashed him my badge, and I said, "Yeah, I am." And he was stuck in prison for a good stretch, and I think he faked a brain tumor and got out, but he served some hard time. When I deposed him twice in prison, there were rats running around. I mean, he was in a bad place. The bathroom was essentially the floor with troughs, and so he did some hard time for the millions that he stole from folks, mostly dentists and folks on rural Route 1. There are more dentists and people on rural Route 1 making bad investment decisions you could ever imagine. I couldn't believe, what is it about rural Route 1? I didn't even know there was such a thing. There must be thousands of rural Route 1s. And that somehow they targeted those people. They must have already been on these sucker lists. But I got all their lists of everybody that they'd taken money from, all the amount of money they'd taken, deposed all of the. And the interesting thing about Costa Rica is everyone speaks English. And it's one of the most literate countries in the hemisphere. And they were very sophisticated. And so I deposed them, and they were willing to talk and learned a lot. But these people fled, and the money kept moving, and it was really hard to catch it. But because of the stuff we learned from the law firm, materials, we were able to anticipate 3 or 4 other crimes. Shut down a lottery scam, shut down a coin scam called a numismatic coin. Numismatic is something about coin collection. There was a coin scam, and then there was a video store scam, and we learned about it in advance essentially, and shut them all down as soon as we saw them pop up. And that had to cost them like $1 million or something, because they take a run at it. Like, they funded each one of these boiler rooms with 200 grand. We found that out from the bank accounts. Every one of them had 200 grand to get started, to buy office furniture, plants, act like a real business. It's kind of impressive in a sad way. That's why I call it international mafia. It was very well organized.
Wow. Paul, the last thing I want to ask you about is we've talked about a variety of topics. Last thing is, lawyers are known for being great deal makers. You've worked on some incredible deals. You mentioned the $19.5 billion exit. I think you also helped take Porch public, which is, last time I checked, has a market cap of about $500 million. So,
It popped up. Look
successful.
at it today. I think it rocketed up the other day.
Yeah, I want you to tell me about the story of Tim Smokoff, who you learned from in deal making and saving. Yeah, I think he saved a near dead deal. Tell me about that story.
Well, and there's only been a couple of folks like Tim Smokoff that I've encountered, and he would be flattered to hear me tell this story. But uh, he's just one of these founders, CEOs. He's very sophisticated. He ran health at Microsoft for 10 years, so he's no slouch. He's kind of a big hitter. He and I have been, CEO, general counsel paired up at, I think, 6 companies so far, including a couple with some good exits. And so the thing about Tim that's interesting, that I think all founders should learn from, is that deals aren't always dead when you hear they're dead. And it's crazy. It's almost like, was it the story of Lazarus in the tomb, right? He's dead, man. He is dead. Deals can look like Lazarus, and then someone like Tim can raise it up. Like, what? This deal is back on? Are you kidding me? This thing was dead. So we had a deal that, it wasn't a huge deal. It was probably like a $40 million sale of some assets, just some assets. But it would have been very helpful to the company at the time, and we were pretty keen on doing it because we wanted to pivot to a pure software play, which we did. And ultimately, that software was sold to Abbott Laboratories. And the assets in question were sold to Nortek, which was a publicly traded company since acquired by an Italian company. But Nortek had walked away from a deal, and it had nothing to do with us. It had to do with their board being upset about results and saying all M&A is off. Let's just get back to our knitting. And somehow Tim just kind of kept pinging our person at Nortek, and just, I don't know what he said, but they had spent a lot of money. They'd gone all the way through due diligence. And I know that because I ran the due diligence room, the data room, and I knew that easily 60 lawyers, accountants, tax experts, and intellectual property experts, and probably regulatory experts had been in and out of this data room for weeks. That's really expensive, really expensive. That due diligence, probably cost them 40 grand or 30 grand to have all those people doing all of that. And more, probably 80 grand. And so to get all the way through the deal and have months of distraction, and then have the board pull it because they're all kind of in trouble for not hitting plan, probably. I don't know what it was, but that's usually what it is when a board stops all M&A activity. You've missed plan and budget. We got to get back to business. Focus on what's in front of us now, buying companies. And so Tim put that whole thing back together. And strangely, it was a brand new team across the board. I mean, so it's not like they just took the work they had done 6 months earlier. They had a whole new team. Like, I had to let 60 new people into the virtual data room, the same virtual data room. And so he'd done a couple of things like that, but that type of perseverance, that deal was dead. That type of perseverance to get a deal done after that is amazing. his successor was also pretty amazing. And it took a lot of effort to, we then, after selling those assets, built up the intellectual property, the software that was used to host health and medical data. And our primary customer was Abbott Laboratories. And we built the background, the back end for what's called LibreView now, which is their bloodless, you know, glucose monitor. And we had challenges, performance challenges on our part. We had to get regulatory authority across 47 countries for this. You know, we probably had 30 employees and we got this thing done. But there were challenges, and Tim's successor, just stuck with this stuff like to a degree I was never even necessarily privy to, but I knew it was crazy, and kept that thing going, that pivoted company, and we ended up selling that to Abbott Laboratories, and a lot of the team went on to Abbott Laboratories, and I was there briefly. I have some Abbott swag around here somewhere from that. That's the Abbott logo right there from that sale. And so persistence in deals is really important. Now, I'm not saying if a VC says, go away, I don't want to talk to you, but if you get pretty far with a commercial deal, you get pretty far with a sale, and something weird happens that derails it, it may not be dead yet. And the folks who, and there's other CEOs, there's another one, that CEO of Porch would persist until something happened and he just would not take no. And I think that's a very important message for entrepreneurs that, you know, something's not dead the first or second time probably. Don't give up on something just because it seems like it's dead, because lots of things strangely come back to life, and it looks like total roadkill, and then what, that thing is moving again, that that looks flat as a pancake. So I think that's a good message and a good lesson for founders.
That's awesome. Well, Paul, that's it for the questions I've got. Anything you'd like to talk about?
Well, you mentioned, my SaaS tool that'll be coming out by the end of January, the General Counsel audit, and that will be essentially a 90 question, yes or no question survey that you take, and you get a full report on everything governance, regulatory, fundraising, legal about your company across kind of every area of business law. And one, it will give you a roadmap for what to do to patch up any holes that could prevent you from succeeding and or fundraising. And secondly, you could take that to a lawyer as a roadmap of stuff that I want to work on. And you, within 60 days, you get to retake the test and get a really improved report because you're going to fix some things. It gives you a score, and it gives you strengths, red flags, and top action items. And if you have a lot of stuff in the strengths column, you got like a 97 score, and you've got very few red flags, maybe need to file a patent application or something, and then some to-dos. That could be something that be very handy for taking to investors after maybe the initial meeting and say, hey, we've got this audit report that you might find interesting. And it's about a 6 or 7 page report, and it could help seal the deal. And so I'll be selling it directly to founders, directly to law firms as a subscription, directly to VC firms as a subscription. And kind of the idea is it's a little bit like Carfax for startups. It's a little bit like, hey, here's the full report on this company. And it gives founders the ability to improve, to identify and improve weaknesses that could be company killers. So I'm pretty excited about that. I'm working with vendors right now to figure out who's coding it. All the business logic is pretty much done. If you have a founder out there that hears this and wants to be in the beta test, I'm doing beta tests for another few days, and I would entertain that. And people can reach out to me at LinkedIn, Paul Swegle, and say they're interested in doing that through a DM or something.
All those links will be in the bio, folks.